Hello, Soundies. Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Great to have you all here today and hope you're all doing well. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to have taken a couple of days off last week and catch up on some things and get a breather and have a chance to kind of take a look into some of my future projects and what those involve. So let's go to the agenda and cover what we're going to talk today, cover our agenda for today. First up, we're going to talk a little bit about Fairlight's new voice isolation, which is a processing effect that you can use to reduce noise, and we'll take a look at how that works, and we'll compare it to a couple of others. So we'll look at Final Cut also has one called, incidentally, voice isolation as well. Isotope RX Advanced has one called Dialogue Isolate, and they all work in a similar fashion. So we'll take a look at those. And then, of course, we do have question and answer. So there was a question that was submitted ahead of time, and incidentally, it was also focused on voice isolation. And then we'll go to the chat and see what questions we have there. But first, let's talk about what voice isolation is. So the interesting thing is that a lot of these companies that are coming out with this now are calling it artificial intelligence. I think technically it's not really artificial intelligence. It's probably more machine learning and neural networks, depending on how it's implemented. But in any case, what it does in essence, each of these in their own separate way, is that they have been fed a whole bunch of dialogue samples, voice dialogue samples, and then they use that to be able to identify in an audio sample which portions are actual voice or dialogue, and once it's figured that out, the rest is considered noise. Now, what Isotope RX does is a little bit more sophisticated than that. It also specifically identifies what is ambiance, and it gives you a separate slider to control how much ambiance you retain as well. It also gives you a separate slider to define how much of the noise you reduce versus how much of the dialogue. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility. But at their core, they're all pretty much the same idea, which is to identify the voice and then get rid of the noise is the main idea. So the first question I think that's important to cover is which versions of Resolve and Fairlight include voice isolation. Of course, this is new in version 18.1, so it's the latest version. And it's my understanding that the voice isolation is only available in the studio version. So that is the paid version. So you can get that. It comes with a lot of different Blackmagic hardware. You get a license with that hardware, or if you want to purchase it separately, it is $295 US for DaVinci Resolve. And I think that's a perpetual license. It's not any sort of subscription or anything like that from what I can tell. So that's actually a really great deal for an app that is an editing app. So it's a nonlinear editor. It is a color grading app, and it's a fantastic color grading app. It's been around for many years. It's also a compositing app, and now it has this Fairlight digital audio workstation all in one, which is really, really impressive. So that's the coverage there. How do we use it? Let's go ahead and take a look here. And I've got a couple of samples on the computer here that I recorded yesterday. And let me just go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I am going to just play this initially. And what I need to do is there's plenty of noise in my live stream room here, so I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and then we're going to play through this, and then we'll come back. So give me just a second here. We're going to mute right here. We're going to get into DaVinci Resolve just a little bit, specifically the Fairlight panel. The Fairlight panel is, of course, the digital audio workstation part of DaVinci Resolve. And it's pretty amazing that DaVinci Resolve includes not only a video editing app, color grading, compositing, and digital audio workstation all in one. Okay, so just wanted to give you a sample of where we're starting. Now, what I want to do here is I'm going to go ahead and turn on voice isolation here, and we'll kind of trigger it on and off, and I'll also adjust the amount. So you get basically one single control amount, and you can go from minimum to maximum, which happens to be 0 to 100. So we'll start somewhere around 50 and we'll kind of tweak that as I play through the sample. Now, what I'd like to do in addition to that is compare it to a few others. So I also have Final Cut Pro over here. Final Cut Pro, same samples are in here. It also has this voice isolation. And you can, again, just like on the other, you can adjust it from 0 to 100%. That's your only control. So we'll play that back, and then finally we'll come over into Isotope RX, and we have, again, the same exact sound sample. And in this case, we'll use our dialogue isolate. And I'll start this at its default settings right there. And we will run through that. Now, this one, of course, you can see has a variety of different settings. You've got your dialogue gain, your noise gain, you have a sensitivity, and you also have an ambiance preservation, excuse me, not prevention, but preservation slider there. And then, of course, you can change the quality between good and best. So we'll play with all of those. Now, the reason I'm telling you this ahead of time is because I'm going to mute myself again so you can actually hear these samples as best as possible without the noise from my room here. So I'm going to go ahead and mute, and we'll get started listening back to these. We're going to get into DaVinci Resolve just a little bit, specifically the Fairlight panel. The Fairlight panel is, of course, the digital audio workstation part of DaVinci Resolve. And it's pretty amazing that DaVinci Resolve includes not only a video editing app, color grading, compositing, and digital audio workstation all in one. It is also very affordable. So even if you get the studio version, which is the version that includes everything, it's about, I think, $295. Or if you buy a piece, many, not everything, but many of the different options from Blackmagic Design, their hardware, it often comes with a copy of DaVinci Resolve. We're going to get into DaVinci Resolve just a little bit, specifically the Fairlight panel. The Fairlight panel is, of course, the digital audio workstation part of DaVinci Resolve. And it's pretty amazing that DaVinci Resolve includes not only a video editing app, color grading, compositing, and digital audio workstation all in one. It is also very affordable. So even if you get the studio version, which is the version that includes everything, it's about, I think, $295. Or if you buy a piece, many, not everything, but many of the different options from Blackmagic Design, their hardware. We're going to get into DaVinci Resolve just a little bit, specifically the Fairlight panel. The Fairlight panel is, of course, the digital audio workstation part of DaVinci Resolve. And it's pretty amazing that DaVinci Resolve includes not only a video editing app, color grading, compositing, and digital audio workstation all in one. It is also very affordable. So even if you get the studio version, which is the version that includes everything, it's about, I think, $295. Or if you buy a piece, many, not everything, but many of the different options from Blackmagic Design, their hardware, it often comes with a copy of DaVinci Resolve, whether it's one of the cinema cameras or I believe the ATEM Mini Pro and above comes with it as well. But in any case, this is a little sample of what you might expect if you're sitting a little away from the microphone. Okay, so there's a little run through on that. And I'm curious, let's go ahead and go out to the chat here and see what people have to say. I'm curious what people's impressions are after we ran through those three there. How the voice isolation in DaVinci Resolve Fairlight compares to Final Cut Pro's voice isolation and Isotope RX's. Thanks, Daniel. It is a permanent license for Resolve Studio. Appreciate the confirmation there. That was what I thought there. Final Cut sounds like you're in a box. Okay.
That's all we have.
That's all we have. Okay, fair enough. Not a lot there. My overall impressions were that It's actually different than when we were testing before on this sample. But what I found was that Isotope RX had a tendency to kind of let the fan cut back in and out at various times, which was a little disconcerting and kind of distracting, I thought. Final Cut Pro didn't do as much of that. And I mean, Isotope RX seemed to do a really good job in terms of removing a lot of that fan noise. Like if you wanted to go really, really hardcore, then it felt like Isotope RX's Dialogue Isolate did the best job. Derek says, so far I've been really quite impressed with DaVinci Resolve 18.1 voice isolation. Indeed. Andy says RX seemed really good. Yeah, it better be for the price. James says Isotope RX. Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't come as a surprise as by far the most expensive tool that we're talking about here, and a very narrow tool in terms of it's just for audio cleanup. Anyway, John says, I'm just listening on a phone, but Final Cut sounded gold. Maybe that's good. I'm not sure if it's good or gold, one of the two. Christopher, willing to post that raw audio clip? If so, I could run it through Cedar DNS 8D and send it back to you for comparison. Sure, I'll get that over to you. And RX is king, but to be expected. Yeah, I think that's, again, no surprise there. But not to have to bounce. Wow. Yeah, and actually I felt like, again, this is the first iteration of this from Blackmagic Design, so I have to assume that, or I hope that they would continue to invest in that and it will improve over time. But it's a really good start, I felt like. And the Final Cut is a great start as well. I mean, I think it does really nicely. And then, of course, if you really need to go to the next level and you're working on a production that justifies it, RX is really, really good at that too. If you really want to clean things up, RX does a really, really nice job. So, good. We did have, Derek has another comment here. Often we'll edit on DaVinci Resolve on Linux and not having to run a VM for RX is wicked. Okay, cool. I had forgotten that Resolve is even available on Linux. Keith says, I think in a pinch I'll use DaVinci Resolve. If more complex issues, I'll use RX10. Seems like a fine strategy. Yeah, and having a variety of them on hand is really helpful. Yanti, is 50% the same removal in Final Cut, Resolve, and RX10? Is the scale the same? I don't know. They don't necessarily tell you. So, well, I can tell you in RX, it's actually noise gain in dB, so that's a completely different scale. So no, RX10 is different than the other. Then Final Cut and Resolve are both between 0 and 100. I don't know if they apply any sort of logarithmic curve or how that's implemented and exactly what you're tweaking. I don't know if it's a combination of amount of reduction plus the sensitivity of the algorithm. They don't tell you. It's all black box, so it's really hard to tell.
Which goes into this one?
They should include a noise-only button so you can see if you're eating into the voice. Yeah, that would be really nice. And in fact, even the RX version does not have that. It has a compare, but it does not have a like a lot of the RX processors usually have a output the noise only. So, for example, the dBreath plugin has a output breaths only, so you can tell what it's detecting. And if you listen back with that and you're hearing a bunch of dialogue as well, you know you're cutting into the dialogue and you want to dial back. So yeah, that would be a nice feature as well. I think these are pretty CPU intensive though, so it may be a little while before we get to that point.
Which goes into that.
Oh, which is this question. How much power does it take for the hardware to use? Let's check. We can check. So let's switch back over to the Mac. And I'm going to pull up Activity Monitor here, and we're going to go to CPU. Now, okay, so here's the thing we have to disclose. We're using an Apple Studio, Mac Studio, with the M1 Max chip in it. So right now you can see it's OBS. It's using most of the CPU right now. But let's go back to DaVinci Resolve and Let's go ahead and run it and see what we get. So I'm going to mute myself first. We're going to get into DaVinci Resolve just a little bit, specifically the Fairlight panel. The Fairlight panel is, of course, the digital audio workstation part of DaVinci Resolve. And it's pretty amazing that DaVinci Resolve includes not only a video editing app, color grading, compositing, and digital audio workstation all in one. It is also very affordable. So even if you get the studio version, which is the version that includes everything, it's about, I think, $295. Or if you buy a piece, many, not everything, but many of the different options from Blackmagic Design, their option, which is okay, that was surprisingly little. So of the way that those percentages work in Activity Monitor there, that refers to the portion of a, let's get it back up here. That's a portion of a core, a CPU core. So right now, where it's just sitting kind of idle, it's using 37%. And when we ran, it was up in the, maybe 70s and 80%. So it was pretty efficient, it looked like. Wasn't pushing things really hard. Just out of curiosity, let's see what Final Cut's doing. Here we go. We're going to get into DaVinci Resolve just a little bit, specifically the Fairlight panel. The Fairlight panel is, of course, the digital audio workstation part of DaVinci Resolve. And it's pretty amazing that DaVinci Resolve includes not only a video editing app, color grading, compositing, and okay, only 40-some%. Let's take a look at RX and see what RX does. And it's pretty amazing that DaVinci Resolve includes not only a video editing app, color grading, compositing, and digital audio workstation all in one. It is also very affordable. So even if you get the studio version, which is the version that includes everything, it's about, I think, $295. Or if you buy a piece, many, not everything, but many of the different options from Blackmagic Design, their hardware, it often comes with a copy of DaVinci Resolve, whether it's one of the cinema cameras or... Okay, so again, not surprisingly, RX is using more CPU than either of the other two. Interestingly, Apple's Final Cut is super efficient. It was in the 40% range, and then DaVinci Resolve was in the 70 to 80% range. So pretty interesting there. And again, not surprising that RX is using more. It's probably using a more sophisticated algorithm is my guess. So that was fun. Let's do more of that. We have a note here from Andy. I use and enjoy DaVinci, but it sounded more like a gate. I agree. It definitely did have more of that gate sound to it, which is where that cutting in and out kind of thing, where during some of the phrases you got the very distinct fan noise as well. So again, hopefully over time it will get to a point where it's more sophisticated. Derek says, I don't understand the CPU utilization. How can you have more than 100%? So you can have more than 100% if the processor is using more than one core at a time. So each core is considered, if a single core is utilized 100%, that's 100%. Then if it's using more than one core, then that's how it can be larger than 100%. Hopefully that makes sense. Sell RX10 before it's not worth anything.
That was while you, I think it was the CPU usage.
Oh. It was working pretty well there for me.
I think he means because it was not as efficient.
Oh, because it's not as efficient. Okay, well, that's okay. We got the CPU cores here to support it. So, and it did do a better job. So, did you check Dialog Leveler, or do you have an example when to use it? Only for bad audio, or is it better to do it manually with the automation? Well, the automation would be a lot more work. I haven't played with that one, Yanti, so I don't have. I mean, we can play with it. I don't know. The places it's going to be best is if you have, especially you have sometimes what you could call a loud soft talker, someone who gets and I think we all have a tendency to do this to some extent, some more than others. Generally much louder at the start of the sentence and then quieter, 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 quieter. Some people, it's more extreme than others, and I think that's generally where that's going to be useful, and it's going to essentially automate the process of automation. So it can make that a lot simpler for you, is the theory. In practice, let's go ahead and take a look at the settings here. I don't have a perfect sample necessarily for it, but let's turn off voice isolation. We're going to turn on the dialogue leveler. You have a few different options here. You know, this drop down, you can allow wider dynamics. So if you don't want it to do as much work, you can choose to do that. You can optimize for most sources, which seems like kind of the general default setting. More lift for the low level. So if you want it to boost things a little bit more when they get quiet, it can do that. And you can tell it to even to lift soft, whispery sources. But I think typically you'd want to start there. Then you have these three switches here for different things. You can reduce loud dialogue, you can lift soft dialogue, and you can do background reduction. Interesting. So it does have a little bit of a reduction there, and then you can boost the output gain a little bit here. Let me see if I've got, this would be this is all real time. I have not tested this at all whatsoever. So let's see if I can get a clip here that would make sense for this. That one looks pretty. There's a sync test, user bits. Let's pull this user bits down here. Okay, I'm going to mute these top two tracks here. Whoops. Move this one up out of the way. And first I'm going to normalize this. So I'm going to normalize the audio levels to -24. There we go. And let's go ahead and try this. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to mute myself here first. Give me just a second, and then we'll come back and play through this, and I'll tweak these settings maybe a little bit. No, not that. This. There we go. One question we got was, can the slate be configured to show user bits after the clap or slap instead of the frame rate? And the goal, of course, would be to see the date in addition to time. The answer is yes, you can do that. In fact, if you go into the app, the answer is yes. In fact, if you go into the Sidus Audio app, for the timecode slate, you click the little shish kebab menu in the lower right, then you choose Show Extra. And under that, you have a menu of all the things that can be shown after the clapper closes. So, of course, okay, so just visually what's happening here so that you can see is I believe the blue is the waveform, and the little yellowish trace or line here represents whether it's boosting or attenuating the level. So at the start of this phrase right here where I got really loud on that one word, it looks like it attenuated it, but it looks like in a lot of the breaths it's boosting the levels, which you don't typically want. But overall it was sounding okay. It was weird. I didn't feel like I got more gain when I boosted up the output gain. I didn't notice that. So, and I went ahead and turned off the background reduction just so I could hear a little bit better what it was doing in terms of leveling. So I'll definitely need to play more with that, but, and actually maybe let's keep going here. I'm going to turn off the lift soft dialogue. I want to use it mainly as like a compressor would be used. So let's see what happens there. So I'm going to move back to here and let's play some more. Let me mute first. The answer is yes. In fact, if you go into the Sidus Audio app, for the timecode slate, you click the little shish kebab menu in the lower right, then you choose Show Extra. And under that, you have a menu of all the things that can be shown after the clapper closes. So, of course, right now, the default is the frame rate that's shown. You can uncheck that if you'd prefer not to see that. You can check down in the second box, which shows the user bits. And if you have the user bits set to the date, then you're showing the date. You can also show some other things. For example, you can do custom text for whatever reason. If you're doing a man on the street, you can also do custom text. You can see in those other boxes there. So for example, if you're doing an MOS shot, you can put that in there as well. Cut. a menu of all the things that can be shown after the clapper closes. So okay, so that actually is interesting. It was doing a pretty nice job there. I definitely want to get in and play a little bit more with this again. Can be a really useful tool in terms of evening things out here. But when we allowed this wider dynamics, it definitely sounded more transparent to me. And it didn't smooth this out as much. So when I had this really loud phrase here, that definitely came through more. And you can see it's doing a lot. It's a much more gentle in terms of its changes there. The concern I have is that you have to be careful, and maybe with the lifting, the soft dialogue, if you have that on, also having the background reduction on can help as much too. So let me actually just try that again. Here we go. Shown after the clapper closes. So of course right now shown after the clapper closes. So of course right now the default is the frame rate that's shown. You can uncheck that if you'd prefer not to see that. You can check down in the second box. Okay. And I didn't mute that time, so we're getting some of the room noise here. But yeah, that looks pretty good, actually. That could be pretty helpful. The thing is, you probably want to be careful about the breaths and any room tone. It might end up boosting that a little bit. But that's true if you're doing compression and normalization, too. So all of those are on the table, so to speak, if you're using that. So cool. Let's go back to the chat and see what's going on out there.
Do you want other questions, too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Derek asks, have you noticed the difference between 24-bit and 32-bit float audio recordings? I received some 32-bit float ones from a Rode lapel recorder and found the processing different. Give me just a second here. I need to get a drink of water. Be right back with you. Okay, Derek, one thing I want to say about the Rode lapel recorders is I'm assuming you're talking about the Rode Wireless Go 2. Those are audio recordings, and this is why I find the term 32-bit float, when manufacturers use that as a feature on their devices or recorders, it can be very misleading. And here is exactly what I'm talking about with Rode. On the Wireless Go 2, you can actually download the files, and you can choose whether it's 24-bit or 32-bit float. But the reality is it's not a wide dynamic range recording from the standpoint that those recorders don't have dual converters in them. And so all it's doing is taking a regular recording and putting it in a 32-bit float container. So I don't know why they did that. To me, it seems a little bit... It just creates a lot of confusion for people where they think they're getting a wider dynamic range recording. Now, it sounds like if they're doing some sort of processing, and yeah, it could be that they're processing that differently. I don't know what, it's a black box as well. They don't tell you what it's doing. So it could very well be different. But have I noticed a difference between them? Yes, potentially. I mean, the biggest difference I've noticed on the implementations on the Zoom F series recorders, I should say specifically on the Zoom F, I would say F3 and above. The F2 was okay, but not my favorite. And then with the Mix Pre series, those implementations, they're pretty clean. I don't notice a huge difference between 24-bit and 32-bit, aside from any cases where the audio goes above 0 dB. The 32-bit float is recoverable. I have noticed that in some cases, they're also implemented differently on the Zoom F recorders versus the Mix Pre recorders, where in the Zoom F recorders, you do not set gain when you're in 32-bit float mode. There's no option to do it. They apply a unity gain for every single microphone that you connect, and it's a really, really low gain, and then you either boost it or drop it in post. So that sounds different than the Mix Pre, where on the Mix Pre, you actually can adjust the analog gain in 32-bit float mode, and preamplifiers have different characteristics. When you push more gain, more amplification, they tend to sound a little different. And so on the Mix Pre, you get a little bit more freedom that way to kind of tune the sound of the preamplifier, the analog preamp, where you don't get that option on the Zoom F-Series recorder. So just a different implementation. Do they sound different? A little bit. But in the case of the Rode lapel recorder, I don't know what they're doing there. Again, they don't explain. So all I do know is that I'm pretty sure you can clip a Rode Wireless Go 2 without question. And so my assumption from that is that they're not doing the type of multiple converter wide dynamic range recording that the Zoom F-Series and the Mix Pre is doing. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay.
Okay, there's a question in kind of a conversation that hasn't been answered yet, and I don't want to put all these up, but basically it's about...
Can you put a representative one up?
Well, that's... yes.
Okay.
But you're not going to get the whole thing. So Fachiri is saying, I wonder how Blackmagic makes income. They forget that they sell Fairlight and color panels. Okay. And then here's the question.
Avid panels don't work with other programs too, though, right? I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Anyway, the point was that
they make money by selling hardware primarily.
Yeah.
And some software. I mean, if somebody wants DaVinci Resolve for $295, they can make money there. I doubt that's a major part of their income. I bet you most of the DaVinci Resolve Studio licenses out there were obtained by buying Blackmagic hardware is my guess. Don't really know, but that's my guess. So they're definitely a hardware. I mean, it's very much, in some respects, it's like Apple. Final Cut Pro, I paid $300 for Final Cut Pro in 2015 and have never been charged since then and have received every single update since then. So they're not making a lot of money from me on my purchase of Final Cut Pro at this point. Derek says, for dialogue editor, would you bump up the gain before using it if you need more than plus 6 dB? Dialogue editor, are you talking about the dialogue leveler, I think, is what you're referring to? Yeah, I would kind of optimize my levels beforehand. So we normalized, in our case, to minus 24 LUFS. I wouldn't want to go a whole lot more than that. In fact, if you switch to the Mac, Danny, you can see here that this one is approaching 0 dB. So, whoops, that's actually behind. Yeah, this is approaching 0 dB here. So we wouldn't want to push it a whole lot more than that before we went through there. But yeah, I would bump it up to a reasonable level, like minus 24. Most dialogue you can bump to minus 24 LUFS and you won't get any clipping if it's recorded well. So I would definitely do that. You can also optimize its level after that too. Do you know if Tentacle pocket recorders are real 32-bit float? Yeah, well, yeah, and see, now we have to say real 32-bit float because they don't specify. I really should call it wide dynamic range recording or something else, or multi-converter wide dynamic range or something, but 32-bit float is just the file container. I think that the Tentacle pocket recorders are using multiple analog to digital converters, or they're using it. Yeah, that's my guess. I think they are. They were hard to clip. Okay, that's everything.
You haven't done the question yet.
Well, we haven't done the question yet. We have a couple things. First of all, should I apply, and this is back to voice isolation, should I apply it before or after other plugins? The way it's implemented in DaVinci Resolve, you don't get to choose the order, I don't think. Let's see. Actually, if we go back to the Mac here, you can choose the order here. Looks like it's doing the effects first, but I don't think there's any way to come into the track effects and reorder these. They are pretty well set, and then your effects that you put are after that. So we actually tried Clarity VX, and we had a question on that right at the start. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But yeah, I don't think there's any, in terms of order, you typically do want to do, it's so hard to know. And everyone says of something a little different, but the deepest problems are the ones you usually want to fix first. So for voice isolation, it looks like it's pretty well fixed. Like it's applying that before it applies any other plugins that you use. So doesn't look like there's a lot of choice to answer that question. Let's actually go over to the questions that were submitted ahead of time because we have one that's related to that from Kevin, which is, can proper EQ help with artifacting when using plugins like Resolve voice isolation? Is it better to put each unique clip on its own track and EQ each track? Yeah, kind of have two questions there, Kevin. I'll get to the next part in just a minute here. Yes, every time you have multiple people talking, ideally they should be on their own track. You're going to get the best results that way typically. So yeah, if you can put them on separate tracks, I absolutely would. EQ, again, in this particular implementation in DaVinci Resolve, again, I think that you can actually change the order here. So if we go back to the Mac again, Danny, I think you can apply the EQ and then the effects and then the dynamics. So you can do that if you wanted to. Will it help? I don't know. Let's try. Let's see what happens here. So I'm going to go on this. We're going to mute this one. We're going to come back up to this track here. And let's go ahead and try EQing and applying. I'm going to turn off the voice leveler. We're going to turn on the voice isolation. We're going to put it at 72 for now. Then we're going to pull up our EQ. And let's see if this makes a difference. So I'm going to go ahead and play through it. Let's see what we get. And I'm going to mute first. We're going to get into DaVinci Resolve just a little bit, specifically the Fairlight panel. The Fairlight panel is, of course, the digital audio workstation part of DaVinci Resolve. And it's pretty amazing that DaVinci Resolve includes not only a video editing app, color grading, compositing, and digital audio workstation all in one. It is also very affordable. So even if you get the studio version, which is the version that includes everything, it's about, I think, $295. Or if you buy a piece, many, not everything, but many of the different options from Blackmagic Design, their hardware, it often comes with a copy of DaVinci Resolve, whether it's one of the cinema cameras or I believe the ATEM Mini Pro and above comes with it as well. But in any case, this is a little sample of what you might expect if you're sitting a little away from the microphone and you've got lots of background noise. This is steady state, what I would call steady noise or steady state noise. It's pretty continuous, doesn't change a whole lot. Let's see how the voice isolation does. Okay, why don't you all tell me what you heard there? I'm curious to hear what you heard there. I heard... I'll wait to hear what you heard. Did it help? The biggest thing I did, of course, was a low cut or a high pass filter, same thing, at 76 hertz. You don't get to control, I don't think you can control in RX here, or sorry, in Fairlight here. You can't really change the slope of the high pass filter. It's fairly gentle. There's some latency, so of course it takes a while for people to hear. But we also, of course, did we did a cut, pretty mild cut at just minus 1.4 gain, 1.4 dB, excuse me, at 1 kilohertz, and then we did a boost after 9 kilohertz of about 2.9 dB to add a little bit of air to the overall thing. Now that's... Honestly, I wouldn't recommend doing this type of EQ at this point. You're really just trying to clean it up some. So, yeah, let's see what everybody says here. Do we have any that have come up yet? No? Okay. I didn't notice it made a huge difference. I think that applying a high-pass filter will help pretty much in any situation to get rid of any low-frequency stuff that's going on, but it didn't seem to change the amount of artifacting. I still heard the fan cutting in and out throughout. So in short, it didn't appear to make a difference. Is it a good idea, nevertheless, Kevin, to have everyone on a separate track? I think absolutely yes, because every voice and every microphone combination is going to need a different EQ curve to really kind of optimize it. So
There's a comment.
John said it helps some, but I'm on a phone. And yeah, I think really what I heard it helping with was just the low frequency content. So in any case, continuing Kevin's question, I learned from you in the past that a best practice is to use EQ to remove odd or unpleasant frequencies, and I do that and it works. As good practice, should I be EQing individual audio recording sessions for the unpleasant frequencies using separate tracks? And yeah, the answer is yes, Kevin. Again, every microphone and voice combination. And honestly, even my own voice on the same microphone to the same recorder on different days or different times of the day can sound different. And so, I mean, it depends on how, what you're doing. If you want the best results, then yes, you should EQ each time. If it is not as important a piece, then you don't have to EQ every time. Just apply a default EQ that you've kind of worked out for your voice in that mic, and then you should be good. So thanks for the question, Kevin. Appreciate that. And hopefully that gives you some insights there. All right. Heading to the chat again. I'm going to rent a Shure ADX5D receiver. On receiver of analog output can be reduced minus 12 dB or normal gain on each channel. What's the best? And do I set the mix pre to line or mic level? Ooh, it's been a while since I used that, Yanti. Output can be reduced by minus 12 dB or normal gain on each channel. I thought the way that the Shure Axient system worked was that on the receiver, that's where you set the gain. So it's sort of a gain forward kind of situation like Sound Device's A20 Mini, where there's a fixed gain on the transmitter and then it's on the receiver that you boost it. And I assume that it's a line level output. So you'd want to set your input to line level, but you might want to check the documentation, which you should be able to get over at the Shure site. I apologize, I don't remember off the top of my head. But my sense is that you set the gain at the receiver, if I remember right. Jonathan, off topic. In the video you dropped today, you mentioned that the TC1 doesn't require one to rejam every few seconds. Is it possible to use one TC1, then jam each camera instead of buying multiple TC1s? Well, the problem is that cameras drift almost universally. So that's why you typically require a timecode generator for each camera, because yes, some cameras allow you to jam them and then disconnect the timecode generator, but then they'll drift. While the timecode, the TC1 will not itself drift to the same extent that a camera will. You could do that and that'll get you in the ballpark, but it won't be perfect sync, especially after 30 minutes. It'll be off by a noticeable amount. So if you're doing multi-camera, I would recommend buying a TC1 for each camera. Shoji, question, just joining the stream. Can you please explain again what a true 32-bit float recording is? I think I heard you say it's implemented differently by companies. Yeah, so 32-bit float recording is it's a horrible name because it refers to a single part of the overall process of capturing what I would call wide dynamic range audio. So 32-bit float just describes the file format that it's recorded in. And a 32-bit float file format allows you to record a massive amount of dynamic range. However, if you don't have the hardware to actually deliver very wide dynamic range to that file format, then you're not really getting wide dynamic range audio. So, and even the widest dynamic range audio that's capable, that the devices are capable of producing today, don't use all of the 32-bit float range. So what the Rode Wireless Go 2 does is it puts the audio in a 32-bit float container, a file, but it doesn't actually have the analog to digital converters or the analog preamplifiers to support really wide dynamic audio. So what it's putting in that container is not very wide dynamic range audio. It's just in a 32-bit float container. So it's almost like you have this massive container and the audio is taking up this much of its overall dynamic range. In the case of the Zoom F2, the Tentacle Track E, the Zoom F3 3, 6, and F8N Pro recorders, and also the Mix Pre 2 series recorders, they're able to actually produce a much wider dynamic range audio feed into that 32-bit float recorder file, because they're using multiple analog to digital converters. So the audio comes in, and rather than clipping at the converter, they have multiple converters. One converter to handle the really high amplitude sounds, and a separate converter to handle the lower amplitude sounds. And then once those have been converted to digital, they bring them together and feed that into a 32-bit float file. So that's the distinction. In the case of the Zoom F series, they use 2 converters. In the case of sound devices, they don't tell you how many converters they use. They use multiple, is all their patent says. So we don't know exactly how many converters they're using, but they're using more than one. And I think that's the difference. The Rode Wireless Go 2, on the other hand, as far as we can tell, because it can easily clip, actually it's quite easy to clip it. Don't take that the wrong way. It is it's not impossible to clip the Rode Wireless Go 2 by any means, even with just spoken word. That indicates to me that it's not using multiple converters. So hopefully that makes sense, Shoji. All right. Jude, off topic. This week I came across an interview you did a year ago with Epiphan Video. Really enjoyed it. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. I just watched your video last night about how to mix a trio, and that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. So thanks for that, Jude.
Okay, this is 3 parts.
3 parts. Sheriff Logs. Off topic. Do you know the market share between Mac OS and Microsoft Windows? The reason I ask is because a lot of people online, or some would say, Mac is more commonly used for audio creative work. How is this possible when the market share is 75.39% for Windows and 15.74% for Mac? Any thoughts? Well, I think in business, like more general business, that's 90-some% Windows. So then if you go and look at the creative world, and by creative world, I mean people that are doing any sort of post for video, then I would say my sense is that it's the inverse. There's probably more like 75 or 80% is Mac, and the remainder is Windows and Linux. There's a little bit of Linux. We just had that come up a little bit earlier today as well. But yeah, that's my thought. I'm not taking sides on that. I use in my previous job, my day job, I used a Windows laptop. Here at home, and for light and sound media, we use Macs. So a lot of the apps that I use are Mac only, actually. John says, it seems like the voice isolation is best when you want to lower the ambient noise, like in a kitchen. You can still hear activity, but clarity on the voice. I agree. Yeah, I think, yes. I agree. And in fact, even with the example that we did with RX, where we actually took the noise down to minus infinity, that didn't sound very natural to me. And I think you would probably want to use then if we come back over here to the Mac, there is this ambiance preservation. I would probably, in a real world situation, dial a little bit more ambiance back, so that we could so it didn't seem like it was in an otherworldly situation. Because when someone's in a kitchen, we don't expect a kitchen to sound like a recording studio. We expect a kitchen to sound like a kitchen. Now, this is, in video and in film in particular, they don't sound, like if you technically compare, they don't sound like real world. They sound like the way you want them to sound. This is the way the filmmaker wants them to sound. So from my point of view, you would dial some ambiance back, but not as much as that would actually be there in the original recording, because that way it's not distracting, but it also doesn't feel like you're in some different world altogether. And again, it really depends on the piece and what the purpose of the piece is, what you're trying to accomplish. So different options there. It's a good observation.
This was an interesting nuance, I thought, on a previous question.
Matt Ruff says, I have the ADX5D. I set mine to mic because I feed it into a DBX 186. If you're going straight to the mix pre, I would set it to line and 0 dB. There you go. There's somebody with experience.
Okay.
Tell you. Ayanti, how do you explain to a client when you screwed something up, forgot to record, distorted audio, or no audio at all? Well, I haven't done that, so I can't speak from experience. But that's why I think when you're on the spot. So when I've hired out as a location sound mixer or a production sound mixer, again, these are not the biggest budget type of situations, but I was being paid. If there was any problem with the audio, I would immediately talk to the director and say, hey, we didn't get audio. We didn't get clean audio on that take. Well, we're going to need another take. And that should not be very often, but you should always be monitoring so you know whether or not you got the recording. And then that way you can fix that problem right then and there on the spot. So that's generally how I would approach it. Andy Greger, I was watching F1 racing today, and a live clip started with really bad voice isolation when you heard their plug-in kick in. What do you think they used for live TV voice isolation? They could use Cedar DNX is a hardware processor that is available, and I've seen that used in those kind of situations. It does have to be tuned, so it can sound really bad if it wasn't tuned correctly. Like if it kicked in and it was way too strong, and maybe they dialed it back some really quickly. When you're doing live sound, I assume that was live. When you're doing live sound like that, you get one shot, and you have to tweak on the fly. So if it came in and they set it to a setting that was a little bit more aggressive than they had intended, and then they're hearing it and they're like, oh, that's not good, and they dial it back, that's probably what you heard there. So it's interesting to me that it started with really bad voice isolation. I'm assuming that it got better after that, so they realized it and they backed off of it. So Cedar DNX is the one that I'm most familiar with. Farici has a question. I was asked to record a round table with 3 people. What do you think of using an Omni mic for it? Not ideal, I assume, but might be okay. Yeah, it'll pick all 3 of them up. So that's good. I think the biggest thing you're going to want to do is make sure you're working in a room that's not super noisy, not very much ambient sound. That'll be the most important thing, because that Omni mic is going to pick up everything from every direction. What audio recorder implements 32-bit float the best? From my point of view, the MixPre 2 series does, because I can still control the gain and record into 32-bit float with multiple analog to digital converters. So from my point of view, MixPre. But I think the Zoom F series is very good as well. They just use a little bit more of a black box approach, where you don't get to set the gain. Okay. Jonathan, I just bought a C70, my first cinema camera. Congratulations. That's a great camera. A great place to start as far as cinema is concerned. Is there a way I can record a backup lower dB audio track in camera while using both XLR inputs and wireless lav input? Not that I'm aware of. No. I have a C70 as well, and I don't know a way to do that. You get 4 tracks. And so your 2 XLR inputs are going to take tracks 1 and 2, and the wireless lav input, which will generally be a dual mono, is going to take 3 and 4. And I don't think there's any sort of facility for recording any backups from there. So you'd have to use a separate audio recorder and then feed the output of the audio recorder to the camera, and then the audio recorder would be your backup. So something like a Zoom F3 perhaps, or an F6, or a MixPre 2. MixPre 2 series, I should say. That means a MixPre 3, MixPre 6, or MixPre 10, Series 2. Okay. All right, well, what I would take away from today, if I were you, is that I think that DaVinci Resolve Fairlight's voice isolation is a great first step. Given the tools that I have available to... Oh, actually, we need to come back to the very first question, which was about Clarity VX. It's at the very top. Right. I'm actually having trouble here. I'm wondering if anyone out there has gotten Clarity VX to work with DaVinci Resolve, because I can't seem to get it to work. And let me just show you here. If we go to the Mac, I have Clarity VX, the AU version, and I've also tried the VST version. It's sitting right here. So if I pull this up, and I go back home and I start playing, we're going to get into DaVinci Resolve just a little bit, specifically the Fairlight panel. The Fairlight panel is, of course, the digital audio workstation part of DaVinci Resolve. So in short, it's doing nothing, absolutely nothing. So I'm not sure if it's a technical issue, if there's something I haven't done right. It does appear to be licensed from what I can tell. So I don't know why that's causing or why it's not working there. So if anyone else there has been successful getting Clarity VX working in DaVinci Resolve, please let us know. And if you have any insights into what can make it work, that would be really helpful as well. So thanks for that question as well. Oh, Shoji, I recently viewed some BTS footage, behind the scenes footage of a 2-person interview and only saw one boom mic above and between the 2 people. How is this done? What type of mic do you think is used? So in that case, yeah, you could use a microphone with a wider polar pattern. So you could use, depending on how it's positioned, a cardioid could potentially work if the 2 people are fairly close to each other. I would avoid using a shotgun microphone in those circumstances, or even any sort of super cardioid microphone. You need to go wider like a cardioid, or if you're using, there are some large diaphragm condenser microphones that'll do a wide cardioid as well, so it's wider on the front. That could work as well. It's the trick with those situations. Everyone wants to use fewer microphones if they can, and that's great. Understood. The trade-off is that the fewer microphones you use, the less you're going to be able to use its polar pattern to isolate any sort of room ambiance. And so that means you're going to have to do more to manage the room itself, more sound blankets, turning off more things, turning off all fans, disconnecting, turning off HVAC, unplugging freezers and refrigerators and all that kind of stuff. So that's the trade-off. So yeah, it can be done for sure, but the room has got to be pretty quiet if you want a really clean recording. You also have the other challenge that you have there too is that you can't mix. So if you have one person who has a much stronger voice just by their nature than the other person, that makes it trickier too. You can live mix it and, fade up when the quieter person is talking and fade back down when the louder person is talking, but that creates that challenge as well. Whereas if you have 2 separate microphones, you can gain them up separate, independently of each other, and they'll sound more balanced.
Okay, we have quite a bit of comments about the plugin.
Okay, quite a few comments about the plugin. Let's see what we got. I think I'm using something similar to Clarity VX. Okay.
What's the name of it?
Oh, yeah. ERA6. It's not quite the same as, it's different. So usually things like denoise plugins, which are different than voice isolation plugins, is that they are using a whole series of gates, a whole bunch of them. In the case of Isotope RX, they have one I think that has 256 gates at different frequencies throughout the audio spectrum, and it's opening and closing all of them independently to reduce noise. That's a completely separate thing from voice isolation, which is using typically neural networks to identify voice and then subtract all of the other stuff. So they work a little differently, and sometimes you actually a denoise plugin may be the better choice. So it's definitely worth experimenting with to see which one is going to work better for your particular clip.
Okay, and then
Christopher, Waves plugins are probably what is broken. They have incompatibility issues with lots of host apps. Been a thing for years. Yeah, I've noticed that I think it's almost like they're made primarily for Pro Tools, if I had to guess. And if they happen to work on other digital audio workstations, that's great. But and I don't think that DaVinci Resolve is particularly good at working with others necessarily either. I think their VST support was pretty, it was a little rough for a while there too. I haven't looked as much more recently. I'm getting back into DaVinci Resolve, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, there are definitely potential compatibility issues. Thanks for that, Christopher.
So this person uses it with Pro Tools, and it works great.
Takes lots of power in DaVinci. Use it with Pro Tools now. Works great. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the Waves plugins, again, are going to be mostly for
And
Pro
this
Tools.
person uses Windows.
Mike, yes, I'm able to get Clarity to work as a VST in Fairlight 17.x and 18. I haven't jumped to 18.1 yet. Okay, good.
Windows 10.
And that's on Windows 10. Very good.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Mike.
Okay.
Cool. All right. Well, that was fun. I hope you had fun as well. For me, I was excited to give that a try and see how it's working. I guess my kind of takeaway is that if I have all of the tools that I have available to me, for quick and dirty, yeah, the voice isolate within DaVinci Resolve Fairlight is not a bad tool. I'm hopeful that they'll continue to invest in it and that it will get better and better. I found that to my ear, the Final Cut Pro voice isolation sounded better. It didn't have that kind of cutting in and out that I got in DaVinci Resolve Fairlight. And of course, without surprise, the Isotope RX was the best of all of them in terms of the overall transparency and the lack of artifacting overall. So that's kind of where I see things right now. But again, it's going to change from audio clip to audio clip, and it's fantastic to have these tools available. So, all right, with that, get out there and make some great sound this week, and we'll talk to you again next week. Take care, everybody.